Ganapade Namaha. Om Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Saraswatye Namaha. Hari Om, and a very warm welcome to our 10th talk on the series Swami Venkatesananda, Experiences and Lessons. Today we have the privilege of listening to Swami Sushilananda Mataji from Albuquerque, USA. I had the blessings of having an hour of satsang with her yesterday when we tested. It was a 1 hour testing of whether all this works. So I got a lovely sneak preview for today's satsang. So I'm very happy that she'll be sharing with us today. And a warm welcome to everyone else to tonight's satsang. I'm sorry about the delay in starting. We've got some program going on in the ashram, so there was a slight delay. So my apologies for that. And yes, we're very honored to have Swami Sushilananda talking tonight because she traveled a lot with Swami Venkatesananda, so she will have many stories to tell, I'm sure. And she also edited many of his books and is involved as an advisor to the Children Yoga Trust Australia. So yes, we're very happy to have you, Swamiji, share with us tonight. So I'd like to hand over to you. Hari Om.
Hari Om, and thank you, Swamiji. Om Namo Narayanaya. It's so lovely to be here together once again. And I have to thank Swami Vidyānanda and Ananda Kutir for making it possible, these very important Zoom satsangs where we can get together, remember, and reflect. It's meant a lot to me. So I think I'll start with the obvious, with meeting Swamiji. For me, it was 1969. I was living as a hippie in the woods in North Carolina, and someone handed me a copy of the Autobiography of a Yogi. Well, many of you know this book. And the main theme in it is the relationship between Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar being his guru. And this gave such an incredible window into what a guru was. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. This is what is missing in my life, guru. I'd never had a name for it. I knew that there was some huge hole in my life, but I didn't know what it was, guru. But where on earth am I going to meet a guru? Living in the woods in North Carolina, no big cities, certainly no yoga centers. So what did I do? We lived in an old house and it was heated by a wood stove every morning. I sat for an hour in front of that wood stove, warming myself and sharing my yearning for a guru with the universe every day. Probably for an hour, I sent out the call, send me to my guru. Well, the universe has its ways, as we all know. And my college roommate, who was living in California, sent me a flyer that was advertising a reunion of all of Swamishivananda's close disciples being organized and hosted by Swami Vishnudevananda in Valmoran, Canada. I absolutely knew that I must be there. So I went. I arrived in the evening, and just in time for the satsang, I went into the huge hall, which was sort of a Quonset hut. It was full of people, maybe 400 people sitting there in semi-darkness, lit by blue light. I was overwhelmed, to say the least, and I sat down in the back and took it all in. I didn't understand a word that was being said, but I did get the atmosphere. I did get this wonderful sense of presence. There on the stage were 7 direct disciples of Swami Shivananda, all of the great ones that you might remember. Well, I was magnetically drawn to Swamiji, And as he moved around during that weekend retreat, I'd follow him. I wouldn't get close, but close enough to hear, close enough to listen as he talked to all the people around him. There was no way that I would speak to him, and yet I couldn't stay away. I was absolutely drawn. But the one thing I did understand was, strangely, he was a threat to my life. I was 25. I had ideas for my life. I had plans. And they didn't include being swept away in the power of Swami Venkatesananda. So when I heard that he was from Mauritius, I thought, phew, I'll never meet him again. I'm safe. And yet a part of me was disappointed. So my plan was to safely, step by step, work my way into yoga in a way that wouldn't sweep me away. I thought, well, maybe I'll go to India. That's where it all started. Or better yet, maybe I'll come back to Swami Vishnudevananda's ashram in Balmoral, where the next summer he was giving a yoga teacher training course that included yoga asanas, philosophy. That seemed good. So that was my plan. I went back to North Carolina, and living as a hippie, we had no running water. So I was at a friend's house taking a bath. That was a big event. And all of a sudden, my friend rushed into the bathroom saying that she'd just gotten off the phone. And guess what? Swami Venkatesananda was going to spend the summer with Swami Vishnudevananda teaching in that yoga teacher training course in Balmoral. Well, it was like an arrow hit me, really like a flaming arrow hit me in the chest and pinned me to the wall. I knew that life was about to change. I was terrified and I was thrilled. So that next summer, I arrived in Balmoral before Swamiji, and he arrived on June 8th. And guess what I did? I hid behind a tree and watched him arrive, watched Swami Vishnudevananda greet him, watched him being escorted to his room, but I stayed behind the tree. I was still not ready to meet him. But that night, he was speaking in the satsang, and it was riveting. Something in me awakened, and I knew that it was time. I had to speak to him. I was sitting toward the middle of the back of the room. He finished his talk. He came down off the stage, and a group had gathered around him to speak with him. But I stood up with the intention, I'm going to speak with him. As soon as I stood up, his head moved around the room and picked me out. And as I moved through the crowd this way and that, he never took his eyes off me. It was an extraordinary, breathtaking experience. And when I finally got in front of him, he looked at me and I said, Swamiji, can I speak with you? And he said, tomorrow at 10, and turned away. Well, that was how it all started, tomorrow at 10. Later, I asked him, when you meet someone for the first time, do you know that they're going to be with you, that you're going to have a relationship with them? Do you recognize them from the past? He said, in fact, yes, I do. But one thing I don't know is how far we will walk together. Well, I walked with him for 13 years. I would have stayed with him all the time, but he did not allow that. But as much time as he would allow, I spent with him. And those 13 years took me to Mauritius, Europe, South Africa, where he suggested that I stay, India, Australia, even back to the US. In on those travels, I met many of you, my dear brothers and sisters. And each place as we traveled, others gathered around him from all over the world. sort of like a band of travelers. Actually, it was a sangam that is sacred and is forever, and it continues here among all of us. For us who were around Swamiji, there was a mysterious interplay between Swamiji, the man, born in South India, honed and shaped by Swamishivananda over those many years, and that incredible presence, that thing that we can't name, but that thing that drew us and held us. There was something there that was way beyond the man. But we were confused. We felt the presence, we saw the man, but us, the small little ego person, and I'm sure others can share this, would think to ourselves, does he love me? Does he even like me? Why does he ignore me? What does that mean? All our doubts, endlessly. But he was able to use our doubts. He played with them in a divine way and used them as a way to teach us. Without those doubts emerging, it would not have given him an opening to enter into our hearts and beings. Just to give you an example of this, one time we were in Rishikesh and we always attended the satsang in the evening. And I was walking back with Swamiji to his room, and it was raining. And I was holding an umbrella over his head, but it was dark. And I kept bumping into him again and again. Finally, he turned to me and said, I need a stable, and I've got a horse. And he set off on his own, without the umbrella, in the rain. I was devastated. I felt like I had failed. I felt like I was so incredibly clumsy. So we went to his kutir to say goodnight to him, as we did each night, a group of us. And as I said good night to him, I knelt before him and said, Swamiji, I'm sorry I'm so clumsy. He took my face in his hands like this and drew close and said, you're not clumsy, you are Sushila. And something exploded within me. I actually got it. I wasn't this kind of bag of samskaras, of tendencies, of past lives, of desires, and aversions. I was Sushila. I was a spark of the divine. I was that. Everything stopped. I knew at that moment that I was that timeless being. And he knew that I knew it. Moments like this, when I actually got it, were rare, but very precious. But though I got it, I also lost it. And I wonder, 40 years later, what actually sunk in? What did I retain? One time, many years later, we were sitting in a parked car in a gas station. He was in the front seat. I was in the back seat. Suddenly he turned to me and said, I'm going to tell you something. I know that you won't understand it, but I'm going to tell you because maybe in 10 years, maybe in 15 years, maybe in 20 years, the time will be right, you will be right, you will remember, and you will get it. So perhaps us being together now and sharing our stories will spark that remembrance, and we'll get some of those things that he hid within us, but are still there, waiting to be awakened. I always wondered, who is he? Who is this man? Who is this presence? And I'm sure I wasn't alone in that. Well, one day he gave a hint. We were in Mauritius. We were sitting on his veranda working when we were with Swamiji, we were always sitting somewhere working together. That was the way he taught us. Suddenly he came out of his room. He looked at us one by one and he said, "None of you know who I am at all." Our jaws dropped, our hearts stopped, but he walked back into his room and said nothing more. So who was he? Did we know? We presumed to know him. We knew this wonderful man. We felt his love. We basked in his radiance. But did we know him? Perhaps a glimpse now and then. One thing that some of us did see, and Yogeshwari will remember this, when he was standing on a stage, sitting on a stage, many people saw either Swamishivananda standing behind him or saw Swamiji himself change into Swamishivananda. And I say Yogeshwari will remember because we were in a car after one of these meetings and he asked me to keep a notebook and write down all the instances where people reported this happening because he didn't know it. And he was just as amazed as we were, which was part of that infinite charm of Swami Venkatesananda. He didn't realize who he was either, Swami Venkatesananda, the man. We also wondered about his hidden spiritual life. And for any of you who tried to ask him about that, I'm sure you got not much of an answer. He kind of shut those questions down, but he gave hints. And one hint stays with me. We were in California, and a psychology professor had asked to meet with Swamiji. This man was fascinated by consciousness, and he was particularly fascinated by samadhi. So he was asking Swamiji all about samadhi, and Swamiji was answering. And suddenly the professor stopped, and he looked at Swamiji and said, "What troubles me is that you talk about samadhi as if you know what it is." Well, there was pin drop silence, particularly from those of us around him. What is Swamiji going to say? You know what he said? He said, "And why, sir, does that trouble you?" He didn't say samadhi. I read about it in a book. Oh, yes, I experience samadhi every day. He gave an answer, but not an answer. There was another instance that was quite startling where he was giving a talk, large group of people. He was on a stage. He was being recorded. And afterward, there were questions and answers. And someone asked him very brightly, very bravely, "Swamiji, when did you achieve enlightenment?" Again, silence. What did Swamiji do? He got up and he walked off the stage. We waited. When's he coming back? We waited, but he never came back. He just left. That was the answer. Another time, some brave person asked Swamiji, excuse me, "How did you come to meet your master?" Again, we were waiting with bated breath. He said, "By bus." That was it. By bus. That was the answer. So back to Swami Vishnudevananda's ashram, where all this began to happen for me. When I arrived, I was informed, and Radha will remember this, that there was no tea or coffee allowed in the ashram. Well, I was a tea drinker. I was actually addicted to tea. So it was very hard for me to give up tea. Well, I had arranged to be the housekeeper in Swamiji's cottage, thinking, well, this is the way that I will get to know him. I can be sort of quiet in the background, but I'll be around him. So very quickly I noticed that Swamiji every day made himself a cup of tea. Now I have to confess, it never occurred to me or anybody else to make the tea for him because we had never met a Swami. except Swami Devananda, and he didn't drink tea. He didn't have people helping him, waiting on him. So Swamiji made his own tea. So I thought, wow, tea is not unyogic after all. And one day Swamiji had a meeting. He was going to be away for an hour. There I was in his cottage. The tea bags in the kitchen were calling me, and I thought, why not? So I went into the kitchen, I boiled the kettle, and I made myself an absolutely delicious cup of tea. I went out onto his veranda, put my legs up on the railing, and sat there sipping my tea, sort of like the maid's day out. Except all of a sudden, here comes Swami Venkatesananda. His meeting was canceled. Well, I was frozen in place, horrified. He walked behind me. He patted me on the head, and he said, "No harm." Well, the next day, I was scrubbing his bathroom floor, feet out in the hall, head down, scrub brush in my hand. And suddenly I felt these fingers walking up my back. I turned around, and there was Swamiji holding a cup of tea and saying, "Do you take milk?" I was astounded. And you know what I learned? I learned that yoga has no rules except love. His love overcame, even if tea had been restricted, his love overcame everything like that. More cottage. This time I entered carrying my brooms, my mop, my pail, and Swamiji was in a little reception room talking to a guest. And as I walked by, our eyes met. And it was one of those gazes that we all know. My heart stopped almost. I walked by. I almost couldn't walk, and went into the first room I found and took out my broom and started sweeping. But he followed me down the corridor, and he stood in the door of that roomway, still talking over his shoulder to the guest, but looking deep, deep, deep within me, the deepest look that I had ever experienced. His gaze was not only mesmerizing, but I knew in that moment that he was seeing me as I truly was. He was seeing me in the past, probably past lives. He was seeing who I was right then and there. After a few minutes, which seemed like forever, he simply nodded. And I think many of us know that nod. And he walked back and returned to the guest. Well, nothing was the same after that. It was like, truly like an initiation, a beginning, a new beginning. Something changed. Swamiji taught us all the time in subtle ways, but he never hit us over the head with his teachings. They always came as part of life, as part of what was happening. And in this case, he was about to start his tour around South Africa, and a number of us were gathered with him in Johannesburg. He was going on to Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, finally Durban. So what did we do? We were a bunch of hippies. So we did the obvious. We got a hold of an old Volkswagen, prepared to follow him across the country. And Ambikananda will remember this well. As we were packing our things into the Volkswagen that night, we noticed that there was no spare tire. And at first we thought, oops, no spare tire. And then we thought, wait, we're protected. We're flying on the wings of grace. No problem. Swamiji is with us. So we set out overnight, driving toward Cape Town, finally arriving the next day at Chiltern Farms, where Swamiji was staying. We were so eager to see him. He came out on the lawn, he asked about the trip, and we told him, Swamiji, we were protected by grace. We traveled all this way with no spare tire. Guess his reaction? He really ticked us off. The final message, to sum it up, was, trust God, but lock the barn door. So the very next day, we, of course, bought a spare tire. Swamiji used every opportunity to ground me. I was kind of airy-fairy. I did not have my feet on the ground. So his teachings in particular for me were grounding. And this one happened in Australia. He had just finished writing a lot of letters, 10, 15 letters, and he put them in different envelopes for different countries. And he asked me to mail them. And he said, do you know where the mailbox is? And I said, sure, it's out there on the street. He said, come. And he took me out onto his veranda. And he pointed out the window and he said, there is the mailbox. See the mailbox. And those who were around him, said that he stood there and watched out the window as I walked out and put the letters in the mailbox. His mantra for me, for everyone else, for himself too, was check, check, check. Not because he didn't trust us, but he knew how fallible the mind was. Well, speaking of mailboxes, I've got an even more interesting mailbox story. I was in Mauritius with him, and again, he had just finished a huge packet of letters. I was about to leave for India on my very first trip alone. I must say I was quite nervous, but he wanted me to take these letters and mail them as soon as I got to India so that they would get there quickly. So that first morning I asked around, where is the post office? It wasn't far, it was a few blocks away. So I started walking, following directions, and after a few minutes, I saw a very large red pillar box, mailbox. And I thought, aha, here's the post office. Thank God for that pillar box. So I went inside, I bought stamps, I put the stamps on the letters, and I went back out to put the letters in the mailbox. But there was no mailbox. I couldn't believe it. I circled the post office. I looked everywhere. There was no mailbox, no red pillar box. So I went back inside and I asked the clerk, where do I mail the letters? He looked at me like I was an idiot and he pointed to a slot in the wall. Mail the letters there. So again, the message was, see the post box. But in this case, he seemed to have sort of tinkered with reality to create a post box so that I would know where to mail the letters. So in fact, the only vision I've ever had in my life was totally pragmatic. It was a red pillar box. Thank you, Swamiji. I will never forget. As I look back, there was one foundation in all our relationships with Swamiji. It was love. You know that, I know that. It was not the person-to-person love that we yearn for, though that was there too in our relationship. But it was truly the undying love, the universal love. The love where everything that you encounter, you recognize as you yourself, not another. Well, I had never had a true experience of this love until Johannesburg in 1982, his last vision there, his last visit there. I walked into his room on some insignificant errand. He was standing there and our eyes met. It wasn't even that usual, extraordinary and wonderful look where we were joined together by that gaze. This was something different. It was like even Gorilla Glue could not part us. There was something that happened. Time stopped. Everything stopped. The present was gone. The past was gone. There was no time. There was stillness. There was fullness. There was emptiness altogether. But what there wasn't, to my extraordinary surprise, was emotion. There was no emotion in this most profound experience of love I've ever had. There was no emotion. It seemed to go on forever, but of course it was only a few minutes, and it stopped. He never mentioned it. There was no need. He never mentioned things that we got. He only mentioned those things that we didn't get. And many of you will remember very clearly those times where we didn't get it. And he used his sandpaper, he used our doubts to teach us in a very sometimes painful way, but always ultimately in a healing way. Another remarkable thing about Swamiji is that he wasn't static. He changed. And those of you who knew him for many years, longer than I did, will have seen more of this change than I did. But one change that I did see was after he had a heart attack. In 1980, he was in India, in Orissa, and he had a heart attack. Something changed. Perhaps he knew that time was short. We'll never know. But he was different. And those of us who were with him after that 1980 heart attack will probably have noticed it. He had always told us that he wouldn't live long. Well, now he knew that the time was approaching, and he didn't have time to mess around. He didn't have time to pussyfoot around teaching us. The time was short also to prepare us for him not being there. One time I was in Scotland with him. Priya Hart was also there. We were staying in a house, I think it was near Glasgow, and I was following him up the stairs. He suddenly turned around, caught me in his eye, and he said, "Don't think that after I die, there will be a Swami Venkatesananda flying around in the sky." I was dumbstruck, but there was grace. And somehow in that moment, I got it. And I said, just as there is no Swami Venkatesananda standing here now, he beamed at me with such love, because in that moment, I had got it, that the person, the individual of Swami Venkatesananda had sometime in the past been absorbed into the one. And nothing would really change when he died. I got it then, but I struggled with it mightily over the years since. What does it mean in a practical sense that there's no Swami Venkatesananda flying around in the sky? Well, we don't actually envision him as that, but I think most of us regard him as sort of a departed saint, some presence with personality that is out there looking after us, lifting us up, that we can turn to in times when we need it. I do too. It's so tempting to make a religion out of our relationship with Swami Venkatesananda. But when I'm honest and I look into what he really did say to me and what he said to others and what he wrote, I don't think that that is what he was trying to teach us. In fact, whenever we as individuals, as ego, found solid ground to stand on, I am this, I am here, this is my job, this is what I do, he pulled the rug out from under us, leaving us tumbling through space, desperate to find a place to stand. And as soon as we found a place to stand, he would pull the rug out from under us. Well, his death was the biggest rug pull. It sent me, and I'm sure others, flying through space, looking for solid ground to stand on. Anything. Where was he? What is he now? How do we relate to him? This I've struggled with all these years. And I move between remembering the core of his teachings and also remembering extraordinary things like this. When Swamiji traveled, he always requested the aisle seat in the emergency exit row, not because he wanted to be first out of the plane if there was trouble, but because it gave him more legroom. I was often the person who booked that seat for him. Well, after he died, I did a lot of international travel. I never booked a specific seat, but every single time I was assigned that same seat. How did that happen? This is love, certainly. Is it a personality? What is it? What is it that assigned me that seat? It's confusing. I don't understand it. And I'm sure many of you have struggled with that same question. Part of him preparing us for his departure had gone on for many years. When I first knew him, he told me that he would not live much past 60. And as his 60th birthday approached, he started dropping these truly terrifying hints. One of us was walking with him, I think it was in Rishikesh, when he suddenly turned and stopped and said with great seriousness, "In 1 year, I will be no more." With that in mind, as his time of leaving approached, he tried to create a stable path, a way to walk in this world for each of us, not a stance for the ego, but a way for us to move through the world with integrity and purpose. For me and several others, it was sannyas. It was Rishikesh, 1982, Shivaratri, the Ganges, a profound moment. Aruna was one who was with me, along with several others. For others, it was something else, something particular and appropriate for their lives. Maybe in a letter, maybe in a word, maybe in a look, something to guide us as a light when he was not there. Well, I've mentioned his death, and I've decided to talk about it, even though it's extremely painful. The way in which a yogi like Swami Venkatesananda departs this world is as a very important part of his life and our relationship to him. And you see, I'm the only one remaining. Everyone else has already gone. At the time, I truly knew that I was standing in for everyone else. It wasn't me especially chosen to be there. I was there as a representative for everyone. Everyone who loved him, everyone who couldn't be there. So that last week, it began on Saturday. We went to Pretoria. It was extremely hot. He had planned to ask for an air-conditioned car, but he forgot. And at that time, since his heart attack, he was very sensitive to heat. And he actually said, "This trip may do me in." He suffered, he got cardiac symptoms. On the way back, we wrapped him in wet towels, but he suffered, something changed. The next day, Sunday, there was a talk at Manny Finger's School of Yoga in Johannesburg. It was a lovely evening and we walked back. But when we got to the Shivananda School of Yoga, he could not climb the stairs. He asked for medication. We said, "Swamiji, can we call the doctor?" He said, "No, no, no." And after sitting there and taking medication, he was able to climb the stairs to his room. Monday was his last talk. He had been in bed all day, barely able to sit up. I actually tried to cancel the talk, and he said no, he would give the talk. But it was impossible to manage how he did it. But he got up, he came down the stairs, he entered into the hall, and as he made his way toward the seat, he stopped. He had a word, a loving word for so many of his old friends, a touch on the shoulder, a touch on the head. Finally, he made his way to his seat and sat down. He was glowing. There was no sign of illness. And the subject of his talk was the Bhagavatam. And if you remember, the main character in the Bhagavatam was Parikshit, the king. Parikshit had been cursed. He had been given 7 days to live. His question was, when death is at hand, what do you do? Well, Parikshit gathered around him all the sages, all the teachings, to use those 7 days wisely. Swamiji said to us, Parikshit had 7 days of life guaranteed. For some of us, we do not have even that. He had 5 days. What to do when death is at hand? What did Swamiji do? Nothing different. He carried on with his routine as much as he could within his weakened condition. No long meditations, no chanting, no special mantras, no prayers. Because unlike Parikshit, he was prepared. After that talk, he was climbing the stairs. I was following him. And I asked him, Swamiji, how did you do that? I saw you lying on the bed, unable to sit up, no energy. Now you gave this scintillating talk, filling the room with love, with energy. How did you do that? He looked at me and he said, all these years, haven't I told you it's not me who is talking? And of course, I remembered him changing into Shivananda. I remembered Shivananda standing behind him. The next day was Wednesday. He had a discussion group in the afternoon and decided to go for a walk in a park nearby. But he cut it short because he wasn't feeling well. But he let it be known to everyone who called and asked to come that evening, open house, everyone welcome, Wednesday night. And somehow people came who hadn't seen him for 10, 15 years, who hadn't asked anything about seeing him. They showed up. They came to his room. His room was full, not only of people, but of love. And every single person who came left with a gift from Swamiji. And those gifts were one of his possessions. He could not stop giving. And after everyone had left, he had a very special gift for me. He said to me, 10 years ago, you did something. And ever since then, I've wanted to talk to you about it. But I knew you couldn't hear me. I knew the time was not right. Now there is no more time. So I will tell you. And he gave me that gift. He told me that teaching. And truly, I don't know if I was ready. It burned in my heart. That night, excuse me, he was coughing. His host, Jyotsna, excuse me, I'm coughing too. Maybe that means Swamiji's here with us. His host, Jyotsna, woke me up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., and told me that Swamiji was coughing. I went into his room. He was sitting in his chair. There were homeopathic pills scattered all over the floor. His water glass was broken. And I knew absolutely and clearly that today was the day when he would die. He wanted to be alone, but he wanted me to bring him medication every half hour. So I sat outside his room on the floor and went in every half an hour and gave him medication. The next morning, I had remembered that Swamiji had told me and others, many of you will remember, that when it was time for him to depart, he did not want people around him crying, distraught, their emotion holding him back from where he knew that he needed to go. So this was difficult. I was full of emotion. I went into the shower and let it all go. All that sorrow, all that grief. I cried and cried, and some kind of grace filled me. And I could feel something like steel entering my veins. I became totally calm, totally efficient, totally able to do whatever was needed in the coming hours. One of the things that he asked me to do was to change his flight from, I think it was 2 days later to that very day, his flight to Cape Town, and also to order oxygen for the flight, even if it took oxygen on the plane. He desperately wanted to be with his beloved friends in Cape Town. Of course, I and the others asked, Swamiji, let us call a doctor, let us call a doctor, but he said no, because he knew that a doctor would be obligated to try to save his life, take him to the hospital, something he did not want. He wanted death on his own terms. So this was December 2nd, 1982. That morning, that noon, all that day, Swamiji was fully cogent. I was packing, he directed me to pack his bags. He gave me other instructions. And strangely, later in the morning, he began speaking in Tamil. Well, there was no one there who understood Tamil. So, of course, we thought maybe he's speaking to Swamishivananda, as Tamil was their common language. A while later, again, I asked Swamiji, let us call a doctor. And finally he said yes, but Hindi, an Indian doctor, and only after 4 o'clock. You see, he knew that an Indian doctor would not blame us for waiting to call him. At 1:50 p.m., Swamiji gave 3 kumbakas, locking his chin, 3 of them, and he was gone. He was absolutely gone. The light in the room, the presence that we had lived in all those years was gone. I sat there next to his body on the bed until the doctor came to sign the death certificate. And then immediately I got up, totally calm. and went to the telephone and began calling all over the world. I know I called some of you. Swami Shankarananda arrived that evening to help with things. And because there was discord between South Africa and India, we weren't able to arrange to send his body back to his beloved Ganges, Himalayas, and Shivananda ashram. So we decided on a cremation in Johannesburg itself. He had told us in a talk earlier that week that on his first visit to Johannesburg, he'd been taken to visit the Hindu crematorium. And he said, that time I came back, next time I won't. Then he held up his hands and he said, are you going to call that little bunch of ashes Swami Venkatesananda? That's a question for all of us. Well, devotees came from all over South Africa, and all the Swamis, Swami Sajananda, Swami Shankarananda was already there, Swami Nishasananda, Swami Shivapadananda. We met for the funeral in the Rameshwara temple, and as everyone came in, they were weeping with disbelief. But it was an open casket, and there were roses there, and we each were invited to offer a rose onto Swamiji's chest. As we approached the coffin, we were filled with peace, with calm. That presence had returned. All our sorrow disappeared, and we returned to our seats in a kind of joy. After the cremation, we returned to the Shivananda School of Yoga. And something I'll never forget, Swami Shivapadananda sang, Brahma here, Brahma there, Brahma, Brahma everywhere, Guru here, Guru there, Guru, Guru everywhere. And those were the only words we needed. A few days later, Swamiji's very dear friends, Lakshmi and Sana Pater, took Swamiji's ashes to Rishikesh, and they were toured into the Ganges. Was this the end? No, he exists here among us. We hold him in our spirits. We hold him in our hearts. His love suffuses us. And many of us had dreams of him after his death. Not only dreams, but they were visions. We could feel his touch. I myself was comforted, and I said to him in the dream, Swamiji, you must come like this again. If you come like this again, everything will be okay. He turned me around, he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, no, I will not come like this again. Now you must find me in the people. And he never came like that again. For 40 years, I've tried to understand, find me in the people. Here together now, I'm beginning to understand the love that we bring together is nothing but him. He said to some of us in his last months, only when the Swami is gone will you find out how much you need each other. And here we are, discovering that now. Om Tat Sat.
Hari Om. I don't feel like talking, and it feels almost sacrilegious to say anything now, but I guess sort of decorum makes it so necessary to do some concluding remarks. So if everybody is agreeable, we won't spend any time in any questions or discussion or anything like that, although I know as friends you probably would like to do so, but I feel very much that this wonderful conclusion, which is actually a very deep and meaningful sharing, we would not want to disturb that too much. I think it would be much more precious for us to now remain silent within ourselves and assimilate what Swamiji has shared with us. So I want to say thank you very much. It was a most wonderful talk, wonderful sharing, and you as well as everybody else has brought Swamiji so much closer, especially to us, the new generation. And so thank you very much, Swamiji, and God bless you. And yes, and then of course we would like to invite everyone for the next talk, which will be Swamishivananda Mataji. She's also here with us tonight. So we look forward to her sharing on the 29th. And so once again, thank you very much. God bless everyone. Thank you for joining. Hari Om. Om Masato Ma Satkamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityo Ma Mitangamaya, Om Shanti Shanti Shanti, Sakuravana Ki Jai, Shri Swami Venkatesananda Mataji Ki Jai.